So let's fast forward a few hundred years. What we now recognize is that implicit bias that were rooted in our reptilian brain have now been introduced to cultures as a norm. And now we develop, we grow, we're raised in contexts where the implicit bias of the previous generations become the foundation by which we build. Which then means that each culture or each cultural group then develops a broader or a lesser spectrum of implicit bias, which means that some cultures might have a bias in areas that another culture may not have. And so as we look at that, we want to point to some very specific ways, particularly in the United States, that we've started to look at this idea of implicit bias and how it's infiltrated every aspect of American life. So when we talk about this idea of implicit bias, we've already addressed what bias is. It's leaning one way or another, for or against an opposing idea. We've talked a little bit about implicit being something that's not necessarily in your awareness. Now, when we add this combination of implicit bias and we throw race into the mix, we really have some mental constructs that are problematic. Because when we even try to define race, it's very difficult to really talk about what races there are. So are there 3 races? Are there 5 races? Are there 10 races? Are there 100 races? A Ford F-150 in Mexico is the same as it is in Detroit, is the same as it would be in Johannesburg, South Africa, the same as it would be in Japan. Because a Ford F-150 is in fact a Ford F-150 any place on the planet. Unfortunately, we can't say the same thing about race. In North America, we can't even agree between Canada, Mexico, and the United States what race is. In our federal reporting forums and each of those governing bodies, how we define race is very different and oftentimes can be very convoluted. And so when we try to identify people via race, what we come to understand is that race is less about biology or anthropology, but more about how governments organize their people in a particular way to provide resources and to count them. And so race becomes an artificial construct that becomes a part of our implicit bias as we develop in the context that we do. Here is the federal definition of race in the United States. And let me read this precursor to you because they do have a precursor to their definitions of race in the United States. So race and ethnic designations as used by the Employment Opportunity Commission do not denote scientific definitions of anthropological origins. Definition of race and ethnicity categories are as follows. Hispanic or Latino, a person having Mexican, Cuban, Puerto Rican, South or Central American, or other Spanish culture of origin, regardless of race. White, but not Hispanic or Latino, a person having origins in any of the original peoples of Europe, the Middle East, or North Africa. Black or African American, but not Hispanic or Latino. A person having origins of any of the Black racial groups of Africa. Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander, not Hispanic or Latino. A person having origins of any of the peoples of Hawaii, Guam, Samoa, or other Pacific Islands. Asian, who are not Hispanic or Latino. A person having origins in any of the original peoples of the Far East, Southeast Asia, or the Indian subcontinent, including, for example, Cambodia, China, India, Japan, Korea, Malaysia, Pakistan, the Philippine Islands, Thailand, and Vietnam. American Indian or Alaskan Native, not Hispanic or Latino. A person having origins in any of the original peoples of North, South, and Central America, and who maintain tribal affiliation or community attachment. As we talk about this idea of race, I want you to ask yourself a couple of questions. There are some categories that we talked about, people from different countries and different parts of the world that were in the same category. How different or how similar do those people look to one another to even end up in the same category? And another question I have, which groups are left out of that definition? So if I am from the Ukraine, am I white or am I Asian? These kinds of problems come up when we try to apply that primal instinct to human beings. And we try to classify human beings in particular ways, and they start to set up for us these stereotypes, these bias, and ultimately can lead to discrimination. We'll talk more about that in these next segments. In the United States, we are all impacted by racial implicit bias. It impacts the way decisions are made and for whom those decisions are made. Even the decision makers are not immune to these racial implicit bias. And the decisions that they make on a day-to-day basis have profound impacts on the people that they serve and in the organizations that they run. Some of those decisions are so profound that they could be catastrophic. They could even be life or death for those people who are participating in those systems.